can get my, there we go. Our panel this morning is on Andy Fitz Gibbon's new book, Pragmatic, Nonviolence, Working Toward a Better World. Andy tells us the book came out just on January 7th. Andy Fitz Gibbon is chair of the Department of Philosophy at SUNY Cortland. He's a guitar builder and musician, a Tai Chi instructor, former president of CPP, and author of a number of books, some of them dealing with nonviolence directly, others of them peripherally. Sanjay Lal, who is one of the panelists, is from Clayton State University, a philosopher there, and is currently treasurer of CPP. I just want to say that I think Sanjay is a profound and creative thinker on Gandhi's philosophy, and I always enjoy what he has to offer about Gandhi especially. Danielle Poe, another panelist here with us today, is Associate Dean for Curriculum and Academic Outcomes at the University of Dayton. She is a former president of CPP and is currently editor for our Philosophy of Peace series for Brill Publishers. Mecca Nagel, a colleague of Andy's at SUNY Cortland, is professor of philosophy and affiliated with Africana Studies and also the Center for Gender and Intercultural Studies there. She has a book coming out in March, a co-edited anthology entitled Contesting Carceral Logic. And I told Mecca I had to look up the word carceral, but it has to do with incarceration. So Contesting Carceral Logic. And finally, another panelist, Bill Gay, who is University of North Carolina at Charlotte Professor Emeritus of Philosophy. He's also former president of CPP. He's written an entire history of CPP and is author and editor of many volumes in collaboration with philosophers from Russia. So I promised Andy that we'd give him a few minutes at the outset. He wanted to say a couple of words, and then I'll give each of the panelists, starting with Sanjay, 10 minutes for comments on Andy's book, and leave 10 minutes at the end for Andy to respond, and then we'll open it up with about 15 to 17 minutes of discussion. So Andy, you wanted to say a few
words? Thank you, Barry. I want to thank all the panelists for being willing to talk about my book. Always feels to me like shameless self-promotion. A bit like Gilderoy Lockhart, here's my latest book, you know, Harry Potter. That's the cover, by the way. It's really pretty. Brill did a great job. I wanted to mention especially Bill Gay, who is on the panel. I actually dedicated the book to Bill. I think largely because of all Bill's work in Concerned Philosophers for Peace over the years. And if I'm right, Bill, you've been to every single meeting and given a paper at every single one. If that's still correct.
So far.
Wow, I mean, that's just astonishing. So anyway, I dedicated the book to Bill, and Bill very, very kindly read every chapter very, very closely as I was writing it on my sabbatical in 2019. So I started beginning of January, finished the book in June, and Bill was on hand all the time to offer really good critique of the book and lots of very helpful suggestions. And then also thank the two reviewers appointed to look at the book for Brill, who also made really good suggestions. Between Bill and the two reviewers, the book improved greatly. So all the good bits, you can thank Bill and the reviewers, and the mediocrity I take full responsibility for. So the book came out of, I've been working on nonviolence for a long time and written a lot of stuff. And the two things I wanted to do was to write a book on nonviolence that is in everyday language, accessible to reasonably educated people and undergraduate students. And so I wrote the book in dialogue format, looking at my own inner processes of the way I've thought about nonviolence. So there are four characters. One represents Mennonite pacifism, another analytical philosophy, another philosophical Taoism, and then a fourth who is the protagonist of the piece, who is a pragmatic non-violentist. And that speaks mostly to my sense of where I am at the moment, influenced by all of those various things. Jane and I have also been teaching non-violence to foster carers and caseworkers in social services for the last several years. And we have a couple of books specifically about care of children, but I wanted something that we could give to these people about non-violence in a more general sense. So anyway, that's why I decided to write the book, and there it is. So Barry, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. We'll turn first to Professor Lal, and Sanjay, if you want to share your observations, comments, critiques of the book, please, I will start a clock for you and let you know when we're reaching near the end of 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Barry. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I would be remiss not to mention that today is actually a very significant day for all peace philosophers, and really for everyone who's concerned about peace in general, this being the 73rd anniversary of Gandhi's assassination. So we never have meetings this time of year. So I thought it would be apropos to just point that out. Now to my commentary, I'd like to first express my appreciation for having the opportunity to look over and comment on Andy's latest great work, Pragmatic Nonviolence. In many ways, I found his mouthpiece, Jack, is someone after my own heart. Jack's declarations extolling pragmatism as it relates to nonviolent philosophy triggered in me an effective response similar to those I've experienced when reading Gandhi's writings. Indeed, Jack's arguments often echo Gandhi's assertion that anything that cannot reach the masses I have no use for, as well as his emphasis on the significance of personal experiments for more fully realizing the value of ahimsa. Ultimately, I'd like to congratulate Andy for a nicely presented and much needed contribution to the philosophical literature on nonviolence by considering both the practical and ethical significance of nonviolence from so many diverse standpoints, including a rights-focused one based on virtue theory, as well as from within different non-Western systems. Andy shows that insights and policies based on nonviolent philosophy are capable of public justification in ways that are called for by a pluralist liberal society. Following Gandhi, I've argued in some of my own work that to be successful, the liberal democratic project must overtly incorporate and promote an ideology of nonviolence, and Andy helps better show just how such incorporation and promotion can be fleshed out. This is a great strength of pragmatic nonviolence, on top of the cogent case it makes for the practicality of nonviolence. In this regard, the work should indeed be recognized as a handy resource to anyone who seeks to address ubiquitous claims about violence supposedly being inherent to the natural scheme of things, claims that peace advocates are ever so familiar with. Additionally, all ethics instructors would benefit by considering the example of moral pluralism articulated in pragmatic nonviolence. At the level of meta theory, Andy does great work countering the tendency of philosophy teachers to present the great moral theories in a way that supposes unnecessarily an inherent antagonism among them. I found Andy to actually give a clinic of sorts on how to present philosophical ideas in a way that better engenders an overall harmony of thought. That in itself speaks to the value this work has for advancing a greater mindset of peace. In my commentary, I'll primarily focus on areas in which I think Andy's arguments can be bolstered. As I've indicated, overall, I'm quite sympathetic to the project he takes on and see it to have great potential for advancing worthwhile research in peace philosophy. In several places, Andy defines pragmatic nonviolence in terms of a practice that, whenever possible, seeks the well-being of the other by refraining from violence and acting according to loving kindness. This definition is charming in its simplicity. Also, it should not be controversial to members of a diverse society in which individuals are supposed to pursue their own varied conceptions of the good. It's worth considering, however, what the theoretical implications are of this definition. Let's remember that in spite of common pragmatist attitudes to the contrary, there always can be found a dynamic and interactive connection, indeed a live feedback loop between what we regard as practically valuable and our accepted theoretical understandings. After all, what options we regard to be pragmatically viable and what we hold, in fact, to be worth pursuing in everyday life always largely hinge on where we stand on more abstract theoretical matters. The apparent and significant differences between Gandhi and Dewey regarding the value of technology, in spite of the former's genuine pragmatist bona fides, is just one example that underscores this point. Thus, it is worth considering whether the theoretical definition of pragmatic nonviolence that Andy predicates his arguments on is capable of yielding the kind of significant ethical results that practitioners of nonviolence should ultimately seek. Specifically, it would be illuminating if Andy's arguments are considered in the context of the position, which holds that nonviolence is best thought of in terms of the absolute refusal to ever inflict harm on another, no matter the circumstances, a position that is alluded to at various times by Andy when he considers the continuum of violence. If we regard this understanding of nonviolence as a great and noble ideal that we should always seek closer realization of, the pragmatic implications that would follow would seem to be much more profound than the typical pragmatist who is sympathetic to nonviolence can anticipate. On this point, Tolstoy's example of seeing a criminal killing a child is quite instructive. For Tolstoy, it is clearly morally preferable to aim for a world in which even in this situation, people will refuse to engage in violence. Furthermore, it is not unreasonable rather to think, as Tolstoy seemed to, that this kind of refusal is in fact most in line with both the well-being of the other and loving kindness. Among other things, it is clear that working to bring about such a world would have obvious and indeed revolutionary implications for how we think of the acceptability of self-defense and what our attitude should be toward death. If, however, Tolstoy is correct in holding that in a better world, we would forego violence, even if we see someone killing a child, it is not clear how emphasizing the pragmatic value of nonviolence can lead us to such a world. Just to clarify, whether Tolstoy is right about what nonviolence requires in the kind of situation he describes is not what is relevant to my point here. The bigger issue I see is whether it is clear that an emphasis on the pragmatic value of nonviolence is by itself adequate for engendering the kinds of revolutionary changes, political, social, economic, etc., that our world so urgently needs. Real briefly, to take another example, if as practitioners of nonviolence, we devote our efforts to seeking to bring about a world in which Gandhian degrees of simple living is widely manifested among humanity at large, the pragmatic implications would be enormous, given current levels of environmental destruction and overall health outcomes. It is not so clear, though, how far only emphasizing pragmatic considerations can take us in bringing about a world of Gandhi-like simplicity that is genuinely significant from a moral standpoint. Okay, so in the concluding part of pragmatic nonviolence, Andy mentions that he's actually calling for a kind of principled pragmatism. Perhaps a worthwhile future project for someone in the field would involve seeking a clear demarcation between nonviolence practice that is principled and nonviolence practice that is merely pragmatic. How are they different, and when is it acceptable to conjoin the two? Also, should adherence to principled nonviolence always trump pragmatic considerations? If so, how can such a commitment to principle be publicly promoted and justified? It would seem that such a project could go a long ways in elucidating when nonviolence should be pursued, even when it appears to lack pragmatic value. Ultimately, having such insight would be crucial for the development of a nonviolent philosophy for our present age that not only advances well-being and loving kindness, but also challenges us in ways that can truly lead to significant moral progress. Thank you.
Sanjay, thank you. You came in a minute and a half under time, so I didn't feel I needed to stop you at all. Want to turn now to, let's see, Danielle, Professor Poe from University of Dayton. Danielle.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. From the time that I heard Andy's idea for this book, I was excited to read it and to incorporate it into my own peace philosophy and peace practice. Andy probably didn't know this before he read this paper, but I've taken much advice from the book that he and Jane Hall Fitz Gibbon co-wrote, Welcoming Strangers, Nonviolent Reparenting of Children in Foster Care. While I've never ventured into foster care, parenting my 3 children and 3 stepchildren comes with many challenges for which their insight has served me well. The very idea of welcoming strangers is an idea that I see in this book as well. First, even though each of the interlocutors knows one another, is a friend, and has philosophical commitments known to Jack, who is presenting the idea and practice of pragmatic nonviolence, Jack is still presenting ideas and inviting feedback that he can't anticipate in advance. And he captures the vulnerability of this kind of discussion among friends well, and with such vivid, true to life details. For example, in Act 3, Scene 1, the characters are gathered to celebrate Anna's birthday. But in the course of the evening, we continue discussing pragmatic nonviolence. I was particularly drawn to the discussion on page 68. Quote, 2 servers begin clearing the dishes and silverware from the entrees. A third arrives with a cake and a single candle. The 3 servers begin to sing happy birthday to you, and all join in the joyful shambolic refrain. As the last note dies uncertainly away, the friends and waitstaff laugh amid congratulations to Anna, who blushes profusely. The cake is cut, handed around, and their conversation continues, end quote. Everything about this description reinforces the habits and practices needed for the pragmatic nonviolence that Andy describes. The scene is one in which I'm sure many of us here have experienced. Your friends tell the server that you're there to celebrate a birthday. Just when you think you've avoided the spectacle of a candle, cake, and singing, here come the servers to begin the festivities. The experience is, in fact, joyful and shambolic, which is a wonderful word. I had to look it up and will certainly be using it in the future. But we also have to notice Anna's deep blush. She's on display in front of strangers as well as her friends. And she seems anxious to return to the conversation about nonviolence. Even when the conversation does turn back to a philosophical discussion, Anna continues to be at once a friend and a stranger. She reminds us throughout the dialogue that she may need additional time to explain her view or explanations of the philosophical ideas because she's a theologian and not a philosopher. Nevertheless, the unique and competing perspectives are precisely why Jack wants to have the conversation. He wants to test his ideas with those who think differently than he does. He wants to encounter viewpoints he wouldn't have anticipated. He wants his ideas to evolve through these conversations with friends/strangers. Another way in which the idea of welcoming the stranger enters into this text is Andy's use of other with a capital O, which is at the heart of his definition of pragmatic nonviolence. Quote, nonviolence is a practice that whenever possible seeks the well-being of the capital O other by refusing to use violence to solve problems and by having an intentional commitment to loving kindness. And one of the things, you can't see it when I'm reading it, but this quote appears in 5 different places. And I think that that is so key to the definition because Andy's repetition of this at key moments throughout the text is an excellent pedagogy for his reader. We continually return to this definition to see if it has held up to possible challenges and applications. We continue to understand what he means by pragmatic nonviolence. And within this definition, I was particularly intrigued by his use of the capital O other. I hope to hear Andy's further reflection on the implications of this kind of otherness and how we might apply it in our own current context. First, though, I'll say a bit more about how other is used in the book. Jack, the character who represents Andy's position, writes, quote, "In my writing, I capitalized other to indicate all of those with whom we are in a relationship," end quote. And through the clarification of one of his interlocutors, we come to understand that this would include all sentient beings, humans and other animals, as well as Mother Earth. The definition then is one which recognizes the deep interconnection between every human, every animal, and with all of the environment. Hence, pragmatic nonviolence is a commitment to continual nonviolence in every interaction and every aspect of our life. Clayton, another interlocutor, describes the practice in the following way. If you seek self-cultivation, then you need to engage in habits that will produce a human life. Confucius spoke of practicing respectfulness, tolerance, trustworthiness in speaking, and generosity. He continues, their approach is to contrast our rote habits, which harden over time with repeated use and are often unhelpful, with the practice of li, the intentional habits that make a human life. Like American pragmatism, Confucius has no ethical framework that transcends the everyday complexities of life. The rituals are all we have to guide us through the messiness of our ever-changing lives, end quote. Our challenge from this book is to do the deep and hard work of identifying our habits of violence in order to replace those with nonviolent habits and characteristics. To do this work, I'm increasingly convinced that we have to find ways to reach across divides and to seek out others' anger, rage, and hurt. We have to somehow be ready to invite those we have wronged to express their anger to us so we can respond with loving kindness. While systemic violence or systemic injustice isn't the largest focus of this book, I'd be very interested to hear more from Andy on what it looks like to use this methodology to reach out to the other we have wronged. Is it worth it for us to invite expressions of anger and violence directed at us? If not, how do we really learn where our blind spots are and the impact of systemic violence? If so, who should we reach out to? How should we reach out? Thank you.
Danielle, thank you very much. I think you did a really nice job of capturing the content reflected in the form of the book and a very synoptic view of the book as well. Professor Nagel, we turn to you now for your observations about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you indeed for inviting me. And I come from the unceded land of the Onondaga Nation, which is part of the Iroquois Nation, that has exemplified basically the principles that we find in this book. And they would gesture specifically at the role of the women toward any war making activities, right? So Andy Fitzgibbon has finished a masterful book in the best dialogical tradition. In fact, with his new book, we are reminded that philosophy is a dialogical play. And in his treatise, it is even performed in a non-agonist style, as Danielle actually just indicated. It is also a fine example of Gadamer's hermeneutic circle, and you all know how seriously Gadamer took play. As I see it, rather than Hegel's agonistic dialectics, Andy's method resembles a dancing spiral, starting with Act 1, imagine a better world, to Act 2, presenting us with quasi-demonic visions of violence at a grand scale, spiraling further to Act 3, which lays out what a better world according to nonviolent perspectives looks like. Finally, Act 4, Andy's provisional answer of an enriched and robust account of pragmatic nonviolence. In the end, including the amusing staged author meets critic epilogue, we get a sense of a spiraling dance of a better world through nonviolent pragmatism and pragmatic nonviolence. I believe my modest role in this august panel is that of the interlocutor who focuses on the sociocentric aspects of his theory. And I would also like to investigate the silence on legitimation of certain forms of state-sanctioned punishment, if I have time. I'm gonna speak fast. So I begin with the ethical dance of the self and other, as evidenced in care ethics. A practitioner and friend of Ubuntu ethics would be very sympathetic to the first definition of nonviolence. Quote, a practice that, whenever possible, seeks the well-being of the other by refraining from violence and acting according to loving kindness. Pragmatic nonviolence encourages human potential and flourishing. This is on page 3. So Ubuntu, a Southern African principle, takes seriously the other in the following way, as it's been popularized by Kenyan theologian John Mbiti. I am because we are, and because we are, I am. This pivots away from the Cartesian Hobbesian egocentric self-certainty and solipsism of possessive individualism and towards the community and towards the rich value of interdependence. I am only human because you recognize me as such and respect me in my humanity. Let me give you a simple example. Western children tend to delight in lavish or modest birthday parties, speaking of birthdays, and have for the most part expectations of getting toys. So I tested my husband, who is Luo from the Kenyan Lake Victoria region. And so I asked him, what was your favorite toy as a child? And his answer was a terse, what toy, what for? No delight in birthday parties, no Christmas gift giving, no toys. And I should of course say that African kids are also very good at making their own toys, such as soccer balls for all to share, right? So is this a case of an experience of child neglect? I suggest far from it. In Western societies or the global North, an early memory imprint of ego formation in toddlers is the acquired pain of sharing a toy, or worse, some other child breaking or stealing my toy. I have vivid images of that, of my brother taking away my Lego, you know, whatever, set. So the hurt is deep. It is as if something of myself was torn, destroyed, because I have formed an attachment to material possessions of what is mine. The virtue of loving kindness then is, in Andy's formulation, indeed a difficult, labor-intensive habit to cultivate. Letting go of possessive individualism seems to be the toughest route to inhabit. Of parents and siblings sharing beds, you know, another reason to call child protective services in the West. But isn't there something very strange about condemning a newborn to their own bed for their own good? Or, you know, when the adult tells a child, go to your own room to calm down, or time out, right? That preparation to adult prison. What if that child lives in a one-room house or hut? Yeah, so there is no other room to go to. Yeah. A Nigerian friend, the late philosopher Emmanuel Eze, once shared with me, Mecca, when you go to an African country, I think I was bound for either South Africa or Mali at that time. He said, when somebody says admiringly, oh, I like your shades, you will be glad to part with those sunglasses. His kindly advice, just get ready to let go of your prized possessions. Janus' admonishment about, you know, to stop hoarding stuff and Ubuntu ethics have actually much in common. Clinging on to possessions is not the path of loving kindness, and indeed it is the stuff of much suffering and expression of violence in the world. Friends of Ubuntu cherish generosity, above else, certainly above autonomy, free choice, the calling cards of the Scottish-German Enlightenment. And also really cherishing a sense of humility. I'm getting here at the value of intercultural competence, which Anna Taft also highlights in her paper on Mali yesterday. So Martha Nussbaum's catalog of disposition, including play no less, which I'm very fond of, have certainly influenced UN decision-making bodies, as Andy suggests. In my co-edited diversity book, Janet Duncan, a contributing writer and disability studies scholar, makes it a point to call Nussbaum's framework a set of golden rules to live by. Regarding play, she adds that for disability studies, inclusive opportunities for play and recreation, including accessible play spaces or adaptive equipment, are indeed aspirational goals. However, I would also caution that, as other critics of Nussbaum's liberal framework have to point out, it is guided by the Western ideal of the autonomous self-interested subject. So I find that, well, this is a case of moral pluralism, point taken. But to me, it is clearly in tension with an interbeing or interconnected framework afforded by Ubuntu ethics. How do I do by my community, or as African-American celebrities, on stage getting the Oscars often ask, am I doing the work so that I'm a credit to my race? Finally, on interbeing and ecocide, Pinker may be right regarding the overall reduction of interpersonal violence and the expansion of freedoms, education for girls being a really important achievement and UN millennial goal, and increasing life expectancy even among the poorest. And maybe it's important, so I'm just gonna push forward here with an example, that every village child gets a tablet to do calculations and philosophy. But that tablet is connected to horrendous resource extraction and brutal child labor conditions in the Congo, not to mention large-scale rape and femicide. And every minute, some 30 football fields get logged in the Amazon. So not too long ago, New Zealand indigenous people got protector rights over a river. The river was declared a person. I believe the Ganges is now a person too. In a nutshell, Andy's definitions of non-violence in a better world are still very much tied to the Anthropocene and may indeed need an additional argument to tackle the biosphere, which in the end will make us question the primacy of human rights. So secondly, the question of punishment. Barry, yes, no?
Yes, we have 2 minutes though, Mecca.
2 minutes. So I want to gesture at Jane Fitzgibbon's analysis regarding corporal punishment, the violence in public schools. She writes, and I've read this book a year or two ago, a Black male student who died as a result of falling over after being brutalized by a school principal or the like. Right? It is, to me, astounding that zero tolerance is a public school policy regarding students' trifle behavior, but it's not enforced as zero violence upon the backs of children and teenagers who are brutalized by the hundreds of thousands each year. And so Andy talks a lot about warfare, state violence in that way. I want to test, the issue of, basically a certain deference or acknowledgement of the use and utility of the prison or criminal legal system. So I'm just skipping ahead to look at, in one point in the dialogue, the criminal legal complex seems to be referred to as doing its job, at least in terms of prosecuting generals who appear in front of the International Criminal Court, a court that many observers in the global South have noted as of being very partial towards NATO US interests. And of course, the US will never allow any of its generals or secretaries of state to be put to trial. However, I submit that courts and the many agents of the so-called rule of law are criminalizing only those really who have marginalized status to begin with. We already see incredible leniency and even deferential behavior of judges towards the January 6th insurrectionists. As the Washington Post yesterday reports, it's not even clear if many of those who are currently employed by the same system of violence, police officers, military personnel, face any indictments at all. The social contract, should it be redeemable? Let me just say a sentence. Jack here mentions that social contract of every kind leaves room for violence. Exactly. It not only does that for those who are considered citizens, but also it condemns, at least in the Leviathan version, those living beyond the pale, those indigenous people. There's no humanity, no natural right to life afforded to those who are considered subhumans. Conquest is their only prospect here.
Draw to a conclusion here.
Right. And so my final sentence then is to end with Martin Luther King and Bell Hooks. What I do know is that there's a fierce urgency of now, a fierce urgency of love, and no time for apathy or complacency, but to cultivate vigorous and positive action working collectively towards a better world. Thank you.
Dr. Nagel, thank you very much too. We can always count on you to provide a variety of perspectives that are normally not considered. So thank you for that. Professor Gay, Bill, we turn to you now.
Thank you. And I also want to thank CPP for having panels on some of the books by members. And I want to say something about what I consider distinctive about Andy's book for members of CPP. First, a few remarks about my role in relation to Andy's book, some of which has already been mentioned, that he invited me to write the foreword. If you've worked with other people on their books, one thing you often notice is the resistance of writers to have anything they have penned be altered. That's not the case with Andy. He was always very glad to clarify parts of the dialogue where I couldn't quite understand what was being said or needed some other clarification. When I suggested other perspectives, other texts that might be integrated, he was fairly quick to try to do so. So that made my job much more pleasurable to have that kind of interaction, because I'm more used to, from many books, having resistance from authors rather than cooperation. What I'm going to do is focus my remarks slightly differently than the others and make an invitation to those of you who are teaching philosophy, especially at an undergraduate level, to consider adoption of this book. And I'm going to look at 4 particular features of the book, and I detail these more in the foreword that I wrote for the book. As we teach, one of the first jobs we have to face is selecting a text. How are we going to get college students to read, understand, and even like philosophy? Well, we know a gifted teacher helps, open discussions help, but we're left with the problem of the text that we are going to use. The average college student, as we probably all know, is put off by most traditional and systematic text. Andy's Pragmatic Nonviolence is not such a text. So that's the first point in terms of a selection of why. And it's already been addressed about the text format. And he returns to the style that we've all learned from Plato of dialogue. If you look at the publishing world, however, you'll find out that publishers of young adult fiction, sometimes called YA, have learned that books with a more conversational style are more likely to catch a young reader's attention. And most of us are teaching primarily younger readers. An advantage of this type of style is that classroom presentation and discussion can then be used to engage students with the story, and then to take them to a deeper level, one that's more philosophical. As has already been noted, this allows for a variety of perspectives to be introduced into the discussion. But I want to note something that also needs to be said, is that Andy has not omitted the scholarly trappings, but you don't find them in the middle of every page. You find them at the bottom in footnotes, where he leads us to a variety of sources that can be brought up by the instructor, or that might be pursued subsequently by the interested student on their own, or maybe even some of the professors may say, I need to check 1 or 2 of these sources myself. But significantly, and I think for this group in particular, the third aspect beyond the selection of a text and the format is the topic. This is a very engaging dialogue on a vital topic, namely the problem of violence that has plagued human beings throughout their history. Andy does a good job of reviewing how the response to violence is typically more violence, and how common that has been. We find it all the way back from Plato in the arguments of Thrasymachus of the might makes right of the interests of the stronger. It persists to this day in the perspective of realpolitik, political realism, that moral principles don't have anything to do with politics. So Andy is putting front and center a very vital and timely topic for us. So this brings me to my 4th point about it, the thesis of the text. He adopts eventually, and is really present throughout, a pragmatic point of view. His own position, both in the main character and in himself, comes out fairly gradually in terms of the discussions that emerge from the conversations. which is another feature that's very attractive about this book, that he can give each of the main characters one of the main positions in philosophy and have them dialogue about it. And I would say, as an aside, it's an interesting way of modeling what I would call linguistic nonviolence. They never come to blows with one another, or even too caustic of remarks for one another. So it's instructive in terms of its topic in the conversations that take place as well. So that what he is able to do is to present views that diverge from one another, challenge one another, but also, and importantly, complement one another. And so that what happens along the way is that the reader is gradually taken to deeper and more nuanced expositions and defenses of pragmatic nonviolence. And let me say this in terms of some of the benefit of the book is that there are so many other features, some of which have been alluded to in terms of the work that Andy and Jane have done with foster caring and nonviolence in relation to that enterprise. And I could continue that kind of list, so we can't do more than touch on a few of these at the very beginning. But one of the things that we're doing, and part of the theme of this conference, is not only our interest in nonviolence and peace and social justice. We've talked about the theme of hope. And I think one of the things we're doing in our teaching is looking to the next generation. And if we're wanting to prepare the next generation, a text like this can be especially helpful in terms of raising the kinds of questions that they can take to heart and then perhaps integrate into their own living, which is part of our goals, is to not just get them engaged in philosophy, but to get them engaged in life. So in these ways, in the summary form, I want to say that I regard pragmatic nonviolence as an important pedagogical contribution to the philosophy of nonviolence. The book itself, if you leave aside the footnotes, is quite accessible to undergraduates and general readers. And then when you bring in the footnotes, you have a basis for going to whatever additional depths you may want to pursue. And in this sense, I think that what Andy has done is to successfully present how pragmatic nonviolence offers a moral and effective response to violence. And as he puts it, advances achievement of a better world. And I want to end with saying that I would also be interested in some of his comments on how he would be able to use this book in conversations with his own students if they start raising some of the questions about what happened on January 6th and how we are going to respond to them, and how his book might help with fostering those kinds of conversations with our students as well. Thank you.
Professor Gay, thank you very much also for a synoptic view of what the book has to offer from a variety of perspectives. Andy, just a quick question, because I haven't seen a final copy of the book, but the footnotes are in fact footnotes and not endnotes, is that right?
They are indeed.
Well, I just want to say, good. That's a pet peeve of mine, that publishers often insist upon endnotes rather than footnotes. And footnotes are really helpful, I think, to readers. And I know from an early copy I saw of your book that the footnotes are very helpful to expanding one's knowledge. So, Professor Fitzgibbon, if you would.
Thanks, Barry. Professor Gann, I should say. Yeah, thank you all very much. Let me just pick up one of Bill's points in terms of using the book with students. The publishers told me to let conference people know that there is a conference rate for the book. They'll sell it to you for 50% off if you want to buy it. And you have to buy it from brill.com, BRILL.com, and use the code 71314. That's the discount code. And I think that the conference rate is available until April. So it's brill.com 71314 as the code. And Brill also, for students, will sell the book to students, to colleges, for $25. That's even more discounted than what they're offering now for students to use the book. And that's a reasonable, I think it's a reasonable price for students to pay. Okay, let me respond to some of those comments, which thank you so much for making them. Going back to Sanjay, if I heard you right, Sanjay, you said the book would have been helped if I'd emphasized more the position of absolute nonviolence. And I want to answer a question that I wrote down as you were talking, is why I am not an absolutist. And I have to say, I used to be an absolute nonviolentist. My early nonviolentism came through the Mennonite Amish tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, and they were absolute nonviolentists. No, they weren't absolute nonviolentists. They were absolute pacifists in their opposition to war, but they were not absolute nonviolentists in their overall worldview, because God and Christ were quite violent for Anabaptists, and Anabaptist farmers are quite violent towards their farm animals. So, but they had this, what they thought was an absolutist position based on the teaching of Jesus. So you would never ever, if somebody strikes you, you would never ever strike them back. So they're absolutists in terms of being opposed to self-defense. I used to have that position, but over time, largely influenced by people in Concerned Philosophers for Peace. I had extensive discussions over the years with Andy Fiala, and he had written a book on practical pacifism where he says why he's not an absolutist. I remember, Barry, when you came to Cortland, to our center in the early days, maybe 2008, something like that. And the students always asked that old chestnut, well, what if your wife was, and there was a bad guy, he was raping your wife, and you had a gun, wouldn't you shoot him dead? I thought, oh, wow, it's every single time you talk nonviolence in a student or public context, they always come back to that, and you spend most of the question time talking about a hypothetical that is really stupid, right? And I was never quite sure how I'd answer that. So what I did was I learned Tai Chi. I learned how to kill people without using guns. So if that happened, I would just, I'd do this stuff on them. But I mean, it was, that absolutist position is so difficult to maintain, partly because of the practicalities of human life. If you're an absolute nonviolentist, I think Barry mentioned it yesterday, you're driving down the road and you kill 1,000 bugs on your way home from work, right? This is a violent action every time you get in your car, every time, if you're a vegan, as we're vegan, but every time you eat a carrot, the ground is being dug up by some machine, most likely, and little animals have been killed. Everything in life is a compromise. So I eventually abandoned any kind of absolutism, because I just don't think you can sustain an absolutist position in just about anything. In terms of violence, I'm that close to being an absolutist, right? When people give me justifications for violence, there's very, 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 very few times that I can see a justification for violence that would not leave the situation worse than it was without the violence. So I think that's why I didn't emphasize the absolute position more, Sanjay, even though I think I'm pretty close to it. Then you said principled pragmatism, principled nonviolentism. And is there any time that nonviolence would be non-pragmatic, right? I think that was part of what you were saying. And that's an interesting question. And I think that goes back again, to the absolutist position, right? That almost like a kind of a Kantian universalism, right? You would never, ever, ever, ever tell lies, even if pragmatically telling a lie for some reason would produce a different result. And again, that's not where I'm parked, really. If my understanding of nonviolence is holds up to scrutiny, that it's a practice. So it's not a theory. It's not something that we just talk about at Concerned Philosophers for Peace. It's actually something that we engage in. So it's a practice that whenever possible, now it's not always possible to avoid violence, but whenever possible, seek the well-being of the other, and I'll come on to that, Danielle, in a bit, the capital O for other. You seek the well-being of the other by refusing to use violence and acting according to loving kindness. And if we can do that, not absolutely, if we can do that at least most of the time, then the world will be a better place. Not absolutely better, we won't get rid of all the badness, but if you can do that in your realm of influence and you can change a situation for the well-being of others, then that's a good thing. That's probably inadequate, Sanjay, as an answer. Let me move on to Danielle and other. And the capitalization of other. You actually explained it really well, Danielle, in your talk, and I couldn't explain it better than you did, right? That the other is all those others with whom we have relationship with. That's other human beings, that's other sentient beings, that's Mother Earth itself. It's everything that we are in relationship with. And I'm quite drawn towards pragmatic naturalism, which has an ontology of relationship, right? That everything that exists as a relationship. And that seems a pretty interesting theory. And if you take that theory of pragmatic naturalism, that ontologically everything is constituted relationally, then we are in relationship with everything else. And it fits with what Mecca was saying about interbeing, that there is nothing that we are not in relationship with. And therefore, we should seek the well-being of the other, capital O. And so rather than having to say every time, everything that we're in relationship with because of the philosophy of pragmatic naturalism, blah, 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 just say capital O, other, right? And it's a kind of shorthand for all of that. There was a funny thing in the stage of production. The copy editors wrote to me and said, you capitalize other sometimes. And I wrote back saying, yeah, it's a device, it's a kind of philosophical device. And so they capitalized other by find and replace throughout the whole document. So every single other had a capital O, even another was capital O. And I had to go back through the whole document and find every single instance of other and say whether it was this philosophical device, capital O, or whether it was just other. But thankfully, they got it right in the end. So,
Andy, we are approaching 10 minutes here, believe it or not, but we're
my goodness.
ahead of time, so I will accord you 5 more minutes, and that will still leave us about 15 minutes of discussion time.
Okay, well, I'll go on to Mecca then. There was, Daniel, you wanted to talk about systemic violence and inviting others' anger and how we would respond to that. I'll have to leave that, and I'm sorry. Mecca state-sanctioned punishment. This kind of comes into the conversation we were having last night with Barry, and we were talking about it again this morning. I find no useful purpose for punishment whatsoever. It seems to me an irrelevant thing. I do think seriously about consequences of actions. And I'll mention the social contract, that we do have a rule of law and we have consequences for breaking rules. Should the law be reformed? Absolutely. But still, I can't imagine society without a rule of law in some form or other. I think what we saw January with the storming of the Capitol, an absence of the rule of law. And that's a frightening thing. If we go down that route, that scares me to death. But I think we do need to imagine different ways of caring for people. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, Mecca, in terms of some people do very bad things and some people seem incapable of not doing bad things. What is our responsibility to those people? And according to my nonviolence understanding, it is to seek the well-being of the other, even the other who does terrible things. You have to seek the well-being. And as a society, we need to have some creative imagination to try and work out what that would be. There's a lot more to be said there. They're also playful. Mecca, thank you for seeing the book as playful. I wanted it to be playful. I really enjoyed writing it. It was great fun. I got up every day and my plan was write 1,000 edited words a day between January the 2nd and the end of May. And I did it and wrote a book. But it was easy because number one, I was enjoying it. And number two, Bill sorted out all the problems, which is great. So I was very happy about that. And I also haven't got time, Bill, I'm sorry, to talk about how you would use this book to foster conversation after January the 6th. But I'm sure you can, and I'm sure I will. But I think that's it, Barry. We can open it up to general conversation.
Okay, I haven't seen any questions occur yet on, oh, well, here we go. Sahar has a question. Do you think that there is a difference between believing in absolute nonviolence in a movement and believing in absolutism for individuals independent of the context that they are in?
Okay, let me read that. I don't know. I do think there's a difference between, I mean, I'm not an absolutist, so I'm just going to say no. But I wonder what is behind the question, Sahar.
So Sahar, if you can post something, maybe we'll get back to you if you can explain what's behind the question. We have another question from Stephen DiLorenzo. Regarding absolute pacifism, I always think it is interesting to offer a tu quoque defense of pacifism. No one advocates for violence at all times. To do this would be ridiculous. Therefore, it's not ridiculous to be a moderate pacifist, to have a non-absolute position on pacifism.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. Yeah. Yeah. We always seem, those of us who are pacifist, in whichever way you're going to talk about that, we always seem on the defensive because people have this assumption that violence is well, of course, violence is the way we go. Violence is the last resort. Violence is the way we live as a society. So when you say, hey, let's not do violence, let's be non-violent. Hey, yo, what a problem non-violence is. It's like, what? But such is life as a pacifist. You have to draw your blinds, Barry, so that people don't shoot you.
Lawrence Whitney has a question for you. How does pragmatic nonviolence connect to your other dialogue book, Love is a Guide to Morals?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. The connection is it's both dialogue. That's the connection. But the subject, I'm sure you're getting at, what's the connection of pragmatic nonviolence to Love is a Guide to Morals? I suppose the Love as a Guide to Morals is part of this definition of nonviolence, right? So the last part of it, you refuse violence, but you act according to loving kindness. And so I suppose the Love as a Guide to Morals book is the last part of the definition of my definition of nonviolence. That's the way we ought to act towards others is with loving kindness. Yeah.
Andy Sahar has clarified the question, saying that wondering whether there's a value to being an absolute nonviolentist in a group that might be less apparent as an individual.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, so the notion that perhaps, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're doing some kind of protest, demonstration, you're walking down the street, you've got the cops there with the shields and the batons. In that case, you exercise absolute non-violence. Whereas if you're going down the street and a thug attacks you with a baton, you might defend yourself, something like that, perhaps. I think with protest, non-violent protest, for a protest to be successful, it has to be non-violent. And both with Gandhi and with King, the training of the Satyagrahi and the training of the non-violent protesters was absolutely essential. Because when you're in a situation where your life is threatened, then there's often a visceral response to use violence. And so it demands training in non-violence. Those who were at CPP, I don't know, must be 9 years ago, I read a paper on the beloved community and trying to analyze why the students had turned to violence after the assassination of King and Bobby Kennedy. And I suggested in that paper that it was because the students had not internalized nonviolence. They were using nonviolence instrumentally in the protest if it would get their way, and when it didn't, then they used violence. And Barry, your suggestion last night that we should just get off the streets and stop, I thought, that's worth thinking about, because unless people in protest are trained in nonviolence, and to going back to what Danielle was saying, you invite that violence and you don't respond with violence. And that was Gandhi's position, that was King's position. Unless you do that, then your protest fails, because if you use violence against the state will always hit you back with greater violence and you create more. And that seems to me not profitable at all.
We have a question next from Rachel Dichter. Thanks very much for the panel discussion. I found it interesting and learned a great deal. I've not read the book, but I'm curious to hear more about the extent to which the commitment in the book's definition of pragmatic nonviolence must be intentional. Can loving kindness be defined in terms of a practiced pattern of action, or do those with an intentional commitment to loving kindness need to be motivated by it in particular instances of nonviolent practice? Or would you take these formulations to be equivalent from a pragmatic standpoint?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. As a non-violentist, my non-violence is intentional and has been intentional for the last 30 years, right? I think it's what, Barry, you were talking about last night with cultivation, right? It takes a long time to cultivate nonviolence. And so that's been, I suppose, my life practice for 30 years is to try and become intentionally a nonviolent person who helps make the world better by interacting in nonviolent ways and loving kindness. Lots and lots of our interactions are nonviolent, and lots of our interactions are with loving kindness without intention, right? The parental relationship with the child is not a thought through intentional loving kindness. It's a much more natural thing. It's, you care for these kids. It's that, going back to Hume and Smith's fellow feeling, there's something about us that we are drawn towards others, not intentionally, if intention is about a thoughtful intent. So I think there is a difference between intentional nonviolence and, I suppose you would call it, accidental nonviolence. Most of us accidentally are nonviolent most of the time, but to seek to work toward a better world, it does require people to become intentionally nonviolent. And that's when Jane and I are teaching nonviolent childcare for foster carers and caseworkers, we emphasize that a great deal. A lot of what you do will be accidentally nonviolent, but for the sake of the child and the child's well-being, you have to become intentionally nonviolent, which is well, it's a practice, and and we're back to neo-Aristotelianism. Yeah, thank you.
Alex Christianopoulos asks, too tempted not to ask, what do you take pragmatic nonviolence to ask from us when it comes to the violence perpetrated by the institutions and corporations which we consent to and fund, the state, but also companies whose products we buy? How responsible for it does it make us? How should we respond?
Yeah.
I drive a Honda instead of a Tesla, for example, I suppose.
Good. My answer to that is you do what you can, right? We didn't intentionally make the world in which we live. We're kind of are we implicitly guilty of all the shit that happens? I don't know that we are. We're just here, right? And you do what you can do. You can't fix everything. And I think one of the issues I've seen quite a lot with friends, good progressive friends, is they face immense weight of guilt and burnout because of what they see around them, and they become paralyzed because it's so big and so weighty. And I can't fix all the corporations in the world, I can't fix the criminal justice system. I can't fix the school to prison pipeline, but I can take small steps, which I can take in nonviolent and loving, kind ways, which might mean, as it does for Mecca, working very, very hard to change the system. Now, I don't, this might be my lack of faith, Mecca, but I don't think you will change the whole system, but you change it little by little, incrementally, because that's the way you change things. If a corporation is doing something which you think is utterly egregious and you feel you must do something against it because of its deleterious effect on others, then don't buy the products, don't invest in the company. Whatever you feel in conscience you have to do, you do it. My hope is, and this will sound horrible, but my hope is not in the big things to change, because I can't control those things. But I can control somewhat my relationship with other people and my relationship to institutions and organizations. And if in those instances I work with nonviolence and loving kindness and you work with nonviolence and loving kindness, then we make the world better. Do we make the world perfect? No, it's never going to be perfect. But we might do something that will improve the life of other human beings and other sentient beings somewhat.
Andy, we have a number of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to them all. We've got about 7 minutes left, but here's one from Rashad, and then I'll turn to Jen Kling. Rashad Riemann asks, thank you, panelists. Andrew, I'm not sure what to make of this, but I'm finding a tension between your reluctance toward absolutism as well as your prohibition of violence. I have 2 questions. First, what is your definition of violence that you adopt in your work? I think you reject absolutism on a definition of violence, which has no formal constraints. Second, if you reject absolutism, how do you motivate the distinctive wrongfulness or wrong-making feature of violence?
Well, there's a whole chapter in the book on violence, and I don't, and Jack doesn't give a definition of it because we chicken out. So I use Barry's definition of it, and I use a number of other philosophers' definition of violence and tease out the different meanings of it, because I don't think there is an absolute definition of violence. And I think if rather than an absolute position, I would take more a kind of a bundled position, right? So in the sense that, for instance, the large part of Barry's definition of violence is intention, right? The intention to cause harm. And I think that's really, really important when we're thinking about violence. So let's have a checkbox with intention. But there's other things that are important about violence, not just intention, but outcomes and consequences of actions. So let's put another checkbox with what are the consequences of these actions. And then there's another thing about agency, you know, can organizations without human agency cause violence when there's no one person you can point the finger at because of a system? Well, that's important with violence, so let's put another checkbox with that. And so then we face, and there's a whole pile of things, and then when you face an action where people are hurt or injured and their life is made worse, and you're looking at the checkbox and you check the boxes, then it's violent. But I'm not going to fight over anybody. I don't fight anyway. But if somebody says to me, well, violence always has to be intentional, and somebody says, no, it's always based on the consequences, I'm going to be what Sanjay said, a moral pluralist. And I'm going to say, well, yeah, intention counts. Oh yeah, consequences count. Oh yeah, you know. And I suppose for that reason, I'm not a very good philosopher, as far as I've met a lot of philosophers. I'm a philosopher of ambiguity. How about that? Perhaps that's my next book, The Philosophy of Ambiguity.
Andy, we come to what may be your last question. We'll see. There are many more, but this is next from Jen Kling. Often when I'm teaching, my students distinguish between the pragmatics of interpersonal interaction and the pragmatics of political action. King did too. They seem to go for nonviolence in the one case and not the other. Are the pragmatics of nonviolence different in the interpersonal and political realms, or are they all of a piece in your view? This connects to Sahara's question.
Yes. For me, nonviolence is about not using violence and seeking well-being, right? And that counts in personal life, that counts in political life. And what works, which is the pragmatic piece, is William James, not works idea, is not merely, well, we've got to give some definition to what works. And I follow James saying what works for good. And therefore we've got to tease out what we mean by good and well-being. And I do that in the book. Is there a difference? I don't think there is a difference. You're seeking the good of the other. If the other is something larger, a society, and it's an individual, you're still seeking the well-being, and you should still be non-violent. I don't think you could be. Yeah, I'm just going to say that. Sorry, Jim, that's probably incoherent.
Andy, we'll take one more question in the order in which they were asked chronologically here. This is from Susan Cushman. I'm taken with the point you made that pacifism is the defense position since violence is the norm. How can we make pacifism more mainstream rather than taking it up exclusively as a defense or means of protest, but as ubiquitous as the sunshine? I haven't read your book yet, but does your book make suggestions toward this end?
I think part of the answer to that is to talk about pacifism or nonviolence as pragmatic rather than absolute. If you go for the absolute, people immediately recoil. You can't possibly be an absolute nonviolentist. But if you seek to influence people and organizations incrementally with nonviolence, I'll give you perhaps it's a little example, but I'm chair of our academic faculty affairs committee that deals with all matters relating to promotion. And we were tasked with thinking about what the promotion process for professors looks like during the pandemic. And though I didn't overtly say to the committee, okay, we're going to look at nonviolence, the statement we produced said something like, during the pandemic, we're asking departments and chairs of departments to act with compassion and kindness. Now that is a non-violent position, but we didn't say, oh, no, we're going to be pacifists, you know, as we influence the academic processes. We simply talked about what would be the way of creating the most well-being in this process. And it was to talk about compassion and kindness and empathy. And that's all components of nonviolence. So without naming it, you can actually do a lot towards creating a better world through nonviolence. Yeah. Again, it's incremental, it's habitual, it's the tiny steps. Yeah.
A good concluding point, Andy. I want to thank our panelists, Bill Gay, Sanjay Lal, Mecca Nagel, Danielle Poe, and who am I missing here?
I think we got them all.
Okay, and of course you, Andy. I urge everyone to go out and buy the book at a discount. The code again is 71314, discount code at brill.com. Andy, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And we'll see you later during the day. For those of you whose questions we couldn't get, I apologize.
Thank you all very much for a wonderful panel.